Okay. Well, hello to everyone who has tuned in for today's talk on Microrayon living then and now. I will start sharing my screen in a second. Okay. I hope my screen is visible. Let me just start presenting. Okay, so yes, done by yours truly. So my name is Elīza Māra, and I have lived in Mežciems, which is a Microrayon in Riga, Latvia. I've lived there since I was 3 years old. So within the exception of a couple of years when I was studying abroad. When I got to London, when I was studying there, I looked at their townhouses and the luxurious Hampton Court Palace where my studies were happening in. I realized that my sense of home was actually in my beloved Microrayons back home. So I came back after having already studied embroidery and dedicated my final project to Mežciems. Without realizing it, I ended up in the Cultural Heritage Master's program in the Latvian Academy of Culture. And for these 2 years, I've studied Soviet heritage and ever since have interpreted it in my art. So it also is happened today that my story is the research of my master's thesis, and I'm moved to share it with you today. Why would I choose to study microrayons, which is a question I get quite a lot. During these 2 years in my studies of cultural heritage and kind of tackling slightly critical heritage studies, I thought it was a really interesting concept to look at because there's plenty of studies done on microrayons and block houses as architectural heritage, but there isn't much about living and household practices, which was the thing I was really interested in. And also because I've lived in Microrayon for all my life, also now currently while I was doing my degree, there were a lot of things that I was seeing in theory and seeing how they were working in real life. So that just made me very curious about what is there to explore, essentially. And also my closest and dearest microrayons are Mežciems, which is where I was living and I'm living. Also Imanta, which is where one of my grandmas live, and Jugla, which in which my uncle was living in, and I have a really strong memory of. We would always have to go and pick him up from Jugla when we were on our way to our countryside. So very fond memories. And I understand, which is really important when talking about the microrayons, is that we're not just talking about Soviet heritage or architecture heritage. We are talking about people's homes. And I'm trying to be very sensitive to this subject because it can be very intimate. And in my thesis, I have looked at what part identity plays in all of this. So obviously, if you criticize someone's home, it will affect their relation to the place. So I'm trying to be as careful and sensitive to the subject as I can be. So moving forward, essentially, what's really special about microrayons in Soviet context is when Nikita Khrushchev came in as a leader in Soviet Union, his policy came with the promise of a separate apartment for each family. And also he said about these houses, which were the new projects at the time, where now they are the old projects. He said that they're logical, simple, and beautiful, kind of going back to the modernist qualities that these houses have, essentially saying that these houses are a machine for living. So also what's interesting that these microdistricts were microdistricts or microrayons, they were built for a diverse society. So which is very different from let's say UK and US. So if social housing was made for a certain group of people, that's not the case with the microrayons. So they were built for a very diverse society. You could have engineers, doctors, actors, artists, teachers, hairdressers, anyone and everyone living in these houses, just because there was such a shortage of housing that this was, possible to have a very diverse society. And also in this microrayon where I was living, and I'm living in Mežciems, the block houses, they have penthouse apartments they're called the artist studios. So they have very high ceilings and very big windows that are from both sides. So you have light all day. Which is obviously intended for the artists, but then also we have one of the biggest hospitals in the city, which was attracting a lot of doctors to live there as well, even now. Also students, which is interesting because we have a lot of students that have their lectures in the hospital, and they also live in the district as well. Essentially, so in socialism, collectivism also played a big role in everyday life. So communal apartments during Stalin's time, when he was a leader, are characterized by compression and population density. And several families lived in one apartment. There was also an elder in the whole house who was fulfilling the function of being a supervisor. So he was drawing up a schedule for cleaning the stairwell, using the bathroom, and he also had a way of settling accounts with the residents of the house, because he was the one who drew up the bill for utility expenses. So the surveillance system was very familiar already in Stalin's time. So this forced kind of collectivism was inevitable, which also greatly affected private space and individualism, quite literally, because there was no room for it. But when the newer panel house projects came, giving each family a private space, the residents also obliged to realize this kind of collective living themselves, which was quite naive, because once you finally give people space for privacy and to have room for their identity and individuality, it's quite naive to expect that building this collective living will be in the forefront of their mind, essentially. So when I was writing up a theory and I was searching for a theory to read, it was really interesting. I found Lynn Atwood, who is a writer and researcher who wrote about Soviet living in Soviet Russia, but then also specifically about women's experience living in the Soviet era, which I found very, very interesting. And she had some really good points in her book. She was looking at each leader's era separately and marking the differences between them. So obviously she wrote about Stalin's time, which is all characterized by the extreme communal living, then moving on to Khrushchev's era and what was different about it. So she described it pretty well. And Atwood writes about the planning of the new projects, that the family apartment was supposed to have a separate private room for parents and children, and no longer have to sleep on the sofa in the living room. And which interesting, when she was she mentioned in that paragraph, it's like a coded suggestion that sexual activities can finally take place in a private room, which personally I never considered before reading that paragraph. But the usual cramped living, which was so common in Stalin's era, was still a habit that was hard to break at times. And there were enough cases where even if a family got finally the big apartment, a separate apartment for themselves, where let's say each person was assigned certain square meters. So that's how they calculated how big of an apartment a family should get. They were so used to this cramped living that they would still squeeze in less rooms, so they have one room to rent out, which obviously would be for financial purposes, but still they were so used to this cramped living that they still felt it was normal to go back to that, even though they had space to not do that. So, which I found was quite interesting. And also about living about the apartments, I was writing really interesting about that, for example, there would be parents, they would get their let's say, yeah, parents and a young child, not a young child, sorry, let's say a child that's I don't know, early 20s, and they got an apartment for them, and it was, let's say, a rather big apartment, and their son, for example, he gets a bride and they want to get married, but for example, the bride's motive for getting married was the fact that their parents had a big apartment that could be exchanged for two separate smaller apartments. So essentially you're marrying just for an apartment, which yeah, clearly takes away all the romantic aspect of marriage, but that was a reality for quite a few people. And what was it like living in an apartment building during the Soviet era? And Atwood wrote it perfectly. She says that it was a common practice for retired residents to conduct lessons for the youngest residents of the house. For example, a former dancer led dance lessons for children of the house. Other neighbors helped by making costumes, and the former gardener defined himself as the main gardening consultant and gave all residents of the house advice on how to decorate their apartment and balconies with plants. And there's a publication that invited older residents to advise their younger career choices, and also was widely used a practice to residents to share their professional expertise in fixing things. So residents rarely needed to call a plumber or electrician themselves. That was very familiar in that time. And yeah, so neighbors have participated in cleaning of the stairwell, also renovating, applying a fresh coat of paint, or the front door. And also there is this performative practice of reprimanding neighbors for their misdeeds that went hand in hand with surveillance from the windows of the apartments that were facing the yard. And also that was necessary to model the perfect, the proper Soviet citizen, what it should be. And yeah, going back to the apartments. So in a lot of microrayons, they have the buildings kind of enclosing a certain area, and there would be windows outwards and inwards to the yard. So the surveillance was taken from the stairwell elder that was in Stalin era, and now it was taken into everyone's hands, essentially, which is, let's say, a breeding ground for surveilling grannies, which we will get into soon. So what has changed? So particularly in Latvia, and I can speak only in the context of Latvia, we've been an independent country, a democratic country for 34 years since the fall of Soviet Union, and communism has been replaced by capitalism. Also, Latvia is a member of the European Union and represents EU values. And capitalism is represented by the saying, time is money, which I think is really strong narrative in current Microrayon living. And it definitely can be observed in Microrayons as well. So in my research, speaking to both long-term residents and newcomers, various domestic realities were revealed, which can definitely be divided into positive and negative. And I would like to start with the negative, so then we can move on to the positive. And as I said, surveilling grannies. That's very common living in microrayons, which so they could be sitting outside on a stool, or they can be just looking out at the windows. That's very common to see grannies who are very interested in everyone else's business. But then also I have to say that's because when in Soviet era, when they were young, that was the culture. Everything was about reporting of someone else's misdeeds. So clearly that has still stuck with them as like main mode of living, let's say. One of the practices that is still they're practicing. The second one obviously is disrespectful neighbors, which I feel like is a very classic kind of theme that goes with microrayons and their living. Obviously loud noise, just disrespecting everyone's space and time, taking up space with their own things in the communal spaces, or not being considerate when parking and stuff, and just being also quite ignorant to other issues regarding the building itself, or yard, or even more microrayon itself. And a big thing, which seems like a small thing, but also it isn't that small, which is not greeting each other, which I've experienced myself living in a block house where we all live in the same building, and we've lived in the same building for years, decades even, but still there are people that refuse to say hi, which is hard because to have a communication to either fix the building's issues, or have just nice interactions, you have to say hi, and that's also lacking. Same going with language barrier. Obviously in Soviet Union the main language was Russian, and everything was Russified heavily in Latvia, and we have still quite a bit of people now, these 34 years later, whose main language is Russian. And I'd say there are new generations coming, including my generation, where I was born in a free country after Soviet collapse. So Russian is becoming harder and more unattainable in a way. So if there are people who are primarily speaking in English, sorry, not English, but in Russian, and others in Latvian, it's hard if you can't communicate. So we cannot talk about more things happening that would extend from communication. So, and also being passive in communication. So as I said, yeah, not greeting, also not participating in meetings of the apartment owners to make decisions on what needs to happen, and what problems need to be solved in the building itself. So that's a very strong characteristic, I'd say, that was coming across, as well being smoking. So when I was taking a course on heritage interpretation, it was interesting. My lecturer was saying that to experience a place, all of your senses has to be involved. The same with hearing, with smelling, with touching and seeing, and then more. So that really made me think that yeah, smoking is a way how to experience that's the smell that you would how you would experience Microrayon, because even though it's by law restricted, you can't smoke or grill or anything on balconies, it's still people still look at it as like an extension of their private space, and really failing to understand or recognize the public aspect of it. So it's very, very common even now, especially in summer when it's really warm. These buildings have really poor ventilation, so everyone's windows are open all the time. So you would smell all the time when someone is smoking. Also, even if it's like inside the house and they're doing it by their vent, and it's going up and down the whole building. So that's definitely one of the worst habits. And the last one being resident hierarchy, which is really interesting when respondents in my focus groups were saying that, because if we look at it, the history is quite recent. And as I like to say, these buildings, when they were built in late 70s, early 80s, the people who were the first to live in these buildings, they feel like they have more authority, more say in what the living should look like in these buildings and rayons itself. So it's really complicated when young people come in who buy the apartments in these buildings and they are really interested in problem solving, which there are some big differences, because even though the young families coming in, they're buying their apartments, so they have a set price on what it costs them to live in a block house, and for how long of an amount of time. The people who were first dwellers in these buildings, they didn't buy their place. Obviously, it was given to them because there was just shortage of housing, and it wasn't no particular privilege either. But they don't see the value or the what would be the name? Not the value, but yeah, just the extent, the weight of a mortgage, of like how much you would have to pay, and for how long it will be there. They just got an apartment, and okay, you have an apartment. So these people who have lived there since, the first day you could get on the building, they feel they have more authority over the people. So, and they're also very dismissive of the young residents that are coming in and are willing to make changes and develop essentially their well-being living in a microrayon. So it was very, very coming to the forefront from my respondents. So talking about the positive things. So the first one that was coming from my respondents was breaking down barriers. So one of the examples was one of my respondents saying that when she's encountering a surveilling granny, she always waves and says hi, and is being very like, hey, I see you. We can have this new kind of communication. You don't have to be so skeptical and spying from your window. We can just say hi, like, I see you, you see me. That's fine. Let's just greet. Which was interesting, or was coming from the newcomers, especially, was the new kind of neighborly communication. And I've had experience with some of these as well. So if we think like an analog way of meeting your neighbors and interacting with them, that would be in the stairwell or in the yard, or I don't know, in the store or somewhere close by, right? What was interesting, now the communication has gone digital. And so there are WhatsApp chats for the whole house to deal with, immediate problems, and arranging meetings and everything. Then also there are, each microrayon have their own group on Facebook, which, when I was saying in previous slides, so the passive communication is an issue, right? What's interesting on these Facebook groups, at least on Mežciems group, what's interesting, they would, everyone would post, especially in summer, a photo of a sunrise or sunset from their balcony over, or they post a photo, or like you can see another block house in the sunset and stuff, be like, oh, our beloved Mežciems and everything, which is really sweet and sentimental, but that only happens in that digital space where, I don't know, maybe because you have an immediate photo to upload or something, but it's very much in contrast of like the actual face-to-face interactions you would see in a block house. Same goes for airdrop, for example. I've had an experience with that, which is funny because I have a really great relationship with my upstairs neighbor. But yeah, one of the respondents, she was saying that she could hear few apartments away that there was a girl who was singing and playing guitar. And she wanted to give her a compliment, but she doesn't know which apartment it is. So, and she knows it's a young girl, and she goes on her Mac and she wants to send a note through AirDrop. She sees, oh, there's, a certain MacBook available. She sends a message hoping it's the girl. And she receives a message back being with a screenshot from Spotify with a heart being like, yeah, that's me. Thank you. And I think that's just so sweet that this is like, it's a communication that's not even like, oh, I'm sitting in my house and I go on Facebook or Instagram, but this is like immediate, close by, but airdrop. The same being with meeting neighbors online on Instagram. I met my upstairs neighbor, and that's how we became friends because he saw my Instagram account, and that's how we met. He was messaging me like, "Oh yeah, if you ever like need someone, I'm very interested in these topics and something we can always have a chat about it." I was like, "Hey, I wonder how do you know that we're living close by?" And he's like, he sends me one of my posts. He's like, "This is my kitchen window." And I've taken a photo of my house. It's like, oh, well, then you either live above me or underneath me. So we have to meet for a coffee, which is the very traditional kind of neighborly things that you would do, like, oh, come for coffee, or, maybe you need some sugar, or like, oh, I'm running out of salt or something. So that was quite funny. And same was with one of the respondents. She was saying that there was a random guy who followed her on Instagram, and she was very surprised, and she followed him back, and she saw that like he was posting stories that were of essentially their yard from her building. And she said at first it creeped her out and she couldn't understand. She was like, maybe someone's spying on her or something. And she messaged him. He's like, oh no, my best friend lives in that building, so I always post when I'm there. And that's how like they got to know each other, which I find very, in a way, endearing, and it's just new. It's a new way of communication. Same being with, again, with my upstairs neighbor. He like we are very similar in a lot of ways, but yeah, my husband is the one who listens to music at home, and he does it louder than I do. And yeah, and my upstairs neighbor could hear sometimes what he's playing, and he would Shazam to know to like save the song. Because we also both have very similar taste in music, and the same goes with him. Sometimes we hear that he's listening to like opera or something or classical music. We're like, oh, it's actually pretty good. Like I'm fine with hearing with that. So as I'm saying, new way of communication. Hey, same being with yeah, respect when warning neighbors about noise, just being respectful, and then doing it in advance, not being, hey, this is my right to do in my apartment whatever I need to do, but actually warning if there's a party or renovations going, or anything louder than usual, which is very nice. And also what is a very big positive thing is active problem solving neighbors. And when I was saying beforehand about capitalism and time is money, this is exactly it. And a lot of people really appreciate, there are some people who are willing to take on the responsibility of knowing what needs to be done and communicating it further. It's really well received in a lot of cases, because essentially they do most of the sourcing work, and then they know how to serve the information to their neighbors, which just helps to be involved more. Like if I wouldn't have the time to just like and capacity to go through all these planning documents and stuff, but if there's someone else who really understands and it comes easy to them, I'm very grateful when they just give me a heads up and I just have to sign and participate and do my deed essentially. So that's definitely a big plus. And obviously, fantastic flower beds. I feel like there just needs to be a competition in every microrayon about which is the best or the interesting or elaborate flower bed. A lot of people have mentioned that this DIY gardening culture in microrayons is very different. It has some zing to it, which is really interesting because it's not just neat and manicured and perfect. There is some sort of liberation, like creative freedom, which is really nice, and it really should be documented. Who knows, maybe that's my next task. But it's something that gives character to the place. And yeah, some could argue it's nice or not nice, but it definitely gives character, and definitely says that they are taking some pride in where they're living, and that's definitely important. Also, another thing is cat culture. There is a lot of stray cats that are not really stray cats. They are just regular cats that are just going for a walk, and everyone else thinks that they're stray cats, and there are always some grannies who are feeding them because, oh, poor little cats. that also is a whole nother thing. And another cliche, which apparently lives in some sort of different neighborhoods, or very particularly in some yards, children playing in the yard. That's very classic Microrayon. A lot of people say that when they have grown up in Microrayon, that was their childhood. Just like you go out all day, you play in the yard, meet other kids, and then get to know them and just become friends. So I was really intrigued to hear that that's still happening, because personally, even though I've lived in Microrayon itself myself, and then went to my grandma's and everything, like I couldn't ever make friends because I come from essentially exclusively Latvian speaking family. And most of the times the kids were speaking Russian, so I had a really hard time communicating with them, even though if I understood what they were saying, I couldn't particularly engage in conversation with them. So it's just fascinating to hear these stories that these are still happening. So yeah, but what would we like to see in the Microrayon happening in the future? That was a question I was asking my respondents and also myself. And my respondents indicated that they wanted a new type of collective living that was voluntary, which I thought was very interesting. They were saying that they want a greater sense of belonging, which is provided by, for example, neighborhood festivals, which sounds actually in English, it sounds really nice. In Latvian, it doesn't have enough like pizzazz when it's said in Latvian. But essentially, in the past few years, to give like a cultural background, we have every summer, every city, I'd say, in Latvia, they have a summer festival. Essentially, it's just like a celebration of the city, and there's always like a little like market and a concert and something. And for the past few years, they have kind of scaled it down. They had like a whole like cities of Riga's festival, but they have also made it smaller and put it in microrayons as well, which has been received actually really well, because they have activities for kids, for families, for they have a concert, and that's actually is one of the things that's fostering this sense of belonging, which is really important to the residents. And for example, last year's summer program, there were neighborhood tours organized by Blockhouse Community, and I really suggest look them up on Instagram, which was so smart. I was assisting on that project, which was really interesting to see, and I'm so sad that we don't get to realize it this year as well. But there were very different tours in several, I think there were 6 tours in several microdistricts in Riga, and they called it Microdistrict Summer, which was perfect. And there were very different themes. So, for example, in Jugla, they had a quiet walk. So you were just walking and just being quiet. In Sarkandauga, I believe they were collecting sounds on their phone, and then they had a workshop of making it into a musical composition. Then there were, because in Riga we have a river flowing through, they had a tour from opposite neighborhoods where they were taking boats to meet in the middle of the river. So there were a lot of really fun ways to explore different microrayons. And my respondents were saying that they loved it because it was like an exchange program. You go and you see how others are living, and either it's like, oh, that's interesting, or they are like, oh, they're sprucing up some feathers, being like, oh, well, maybe we can do something similar, which definitely, I think, helped to kind of move this question a little bit more about the reputation of microrayons. And also the respondents mentioned that there is a lack of public spaces in their districts, which is really, really important. In some older microrayons, they have built public spaces. For example, in Imant, they have a culture center where they have, for example, for Easter and something, they have shows for kids and like theaters coming and doing their shows, and some exhibitions from local handicrafts organizations and stuff. And that's really filling this public space, cultural space function. For example, in Mežciems, on the other hand, because it's one of the youngest micro districts in in Riga. They just didn't have enough time to make one, because also I think they had to cut the funds or something. So, for example, we don't have a gathering space, and the respondents were saying that they would like to have like a cafe or a coffee shop, or on like Saturday morning go for a walk with their dog, grab a coffee, and accidentally like mixing with fellow residents, accidentally meeting them and then getting to know them, which was really interesting, that was their important to them. And what was really sweet, one of the participants also pointed out um, our expressed individuality, that we each run through the yard, we run through the stairwell, and we only perceive our apartment as a private space, as a home. And he said it would be really important if we all realize that each of us owns a piece of the district, and we can cultivate it, be happy and be proud of it, which would also just increase our sense of belonging and also sense of agency, that we can do things with it all together, which I think is really, really important. And lastly, I have a little bonus that I really wanted to share, which I thought was really interesting when I was doing my research. Um, it is about post-Soviet identity. In a lot of spaces, doesn't matter, international or even national, there are still situations where, for example, Latvia is being referred to as a post-Soviet country. And a lot of people are having issue with that because obviously we've been an independent country for 34 years. I was reading about this phenomenon and how it lives. And so both the traumatic history of the Soviet regime, the household practices, and the stereotypes of the neighborhoods, they don't promote a sense of belonging, which is really closely related to identity. And obviously, going through these theory materials, I found a really cool article that I really wanted to share. So we each have multiple identities in parallel that are not mutually exclusive. So, for example, in the case of being a Latvian, you can take the most stereotypical idea of a Latvian, like celebrating midsummer with a flower crown, with a beer in hand, and eating some cheese, which could be one identity. Then the other one could be a European cosmopolitan, a citizen of the world in a way. Or can be this post-Soviet identity, and all of them can exist at the same time, and they're not excluding one or the other. And what's interesting, it can surface by entering an environment that recalls this past time in memory or emotion, or directly by entering a completely contrasting environment where this identity surfaces. So, for example, I've felt in myself, if I would travel, I've traveled to like Lithuania or Estonia, and I feel this sense of like belonging because there are plenty of things that remind me of home. Like I see that they have block houses as well, but they're different kind of block houses. So I'm like, okay, in some sense, we can be having an interesting discussion and bonding over things that are similar. Or when I was living in London, because it was a completely different culture, I noticed more things that are really mine and contrasting in that. And then I realized, okay, well, this actually could be, because of the Soviet history, or because I'm very Latvian, and our, idea of life could be very different than theirs. So I thought this was really interesting. And then I found a really good quote that I just want to plaster it everywhere, that this proverbial post-Soviet era will end when the last irony of fate viewer chokes on the last spoonful of Olivier salad. So essentially what this is talking about is there's this yearly tradition that was more in Soviet Russia, maybe more than in Latvia, but it was that every year on New Year's Eve, because in Soviet Union, I don't think you were allowed to celebrate Christmas, so that's why they pushed it to New Year's, so you were celebrating all that on the same day. And this is a movie about New Year's, that there are essentially, the movie begins with a little funny animation of black houses walking around the world and being placed everywhere. So when you as a Soviet citizen, you are traveling somewhere, you see a blockhouse and you feel at home, which I thought was genius. But then also, essentially, the plot goes that there's this guy who's flying home from somewhere, and he flies to a different city, but there's the same street, the same house number, and he goes into a taxi, takes it to the building. It's the same type of building. He walks into the apartment, but obviously it's not his apartment, and it's decorated the same. And essentially, the woman in the apartment, she is in shock and everything, but somehow they fall in love in the whole evening and everything. And obviously Olivier salad is very, very Soviet mayonnaise salad with carrots and peas and things. And what I found really interesting, so when I was reading this article about this post-Soviet identity, is that it said that this post-Soviet identity will be alive until the point these practices will be practiced that were active or important in Soviet era. So for example, celebrating Women's Day in Soviet Union, it looked very different than it does now. So it was important that a man shows up to in front of a woman with flowers and takes her out for a date and then treats her special and everything. But the flowers and showing up and flowers and coming from a man was really important. Same being with New Year celebrations and stuff. So, and the article said that it's not really known for how long this post-Soviet identity can live, because obviously the newer generation, they have less emotional attachment to the history that was there. So these things are changing. And for example, same goes with Russian language. That's already not as common as it used to be. And that was a great ground for keeping a lot of sayings alive and stories and stuff. So all is moving essentially. So yeah, that is essentially all. I'm very happy that you joined and I could share what I found in my thesis. I had a blast writing it. I had a blast reading all the theory and what other scholars had to say about this topic. So I'm very glad to have people who are interested in what I wrote essentially and found out. So you can find me on elizamara.com, or you can find me at studio.elizamara on Instagram and TikTok. You can follow what I'm sharing more over there. And if you like what I do and you are interested in what I will be doing more in the future, you can buy me a coffee. You can either scan this QR code or go to this link, buymeacoffee.com/Elīza Māra, buy me a coffee. I was really excited going into this master's program because I have a degree in hand embroidery before that, and I really wanted some research because that drives my creative practice. And now doing all this thesis, I have like a list of ideas that I want to stitch now and then research more about Soviet living and then so on. So I have my hands full, that's for sure. So I'm very happy, very excited. Thank you for tuning in. If you are watching recording, thank you to you as well. And I'll see you somewhere, I'm sure I will. So thank you very much. And I'll see you soon.